Good afternoon. I'm Juliane Kempfield, and I'm the director of Deutsches Haus at NYU. Welcome to our virtual Deutsches Haus at NYU. We are absolutely delighted to present this conversation among Silvia Boadella, Tess Lewis, and Rachel Cohen about Silvia Boadella's new book, Sophie Taeuber-Arp, A Life Through Art, expertly translated from the German by Tess Lewis, that tells the story of Sophie Taeuber-Arp, a pioneer of modern art whose joyous and multifaceted art spanned 2 world wars and became the center of Zurich's Dada movement. Largely considered the most important Swiss artist of the early 20th century, Sophie Taeuber-Arp was a modern dancer, a painter, a sculptor, a textile artist, a designer, and interior architect. She made paper, textiles, wood, and glass shine. She bound light to matter in paintings, jewelry, embroidery, rugs, marionettes, furniture, and sculptures. Her work is exhibited in museums around the world, and a fabulous exhibition of her many artworks will open to the public at MoMA this week. Thank you to Silvia, to Tess, to Rachel for being here today and sharing their thoughts on this amazing, trailblazing female artist. Thank you to Silvia for writing this book and sharing insights into your family, your great aunt. And I think it is such an enrichment to read this book, which I'll show to you. I think my colleague Sarah will also drop the link for the book in the chat or the Q&A so that you can see it and easily get to the book. And please also check out the amazing exhibition at MoMA. Now, I will introduce Rachel briefly, then Rachel will introduce Silvia and Tess, and then we will continue with the readings, conversations, and later you, the audience, will have the opportunity to submit your questions in writing in the Q&A section of the Zoom. Then Rachel will read them, and Tess and Silvia will respond. I think that's it in terms of the schedule / Ablauf plan. So thanks again for being here. Thanks to the German Academic Exchange Service for supporting our academically inclined events. Thanks to Sarah and Zoe and Christian, my wonderful colleagues who work behind the scenes to make these things possible, and especially to Sarah for running this Zoom meeting. We couldn't do it without you. And now I will introduce Rachel Cohen to you, who kindly will moderate the conversation between Tess and Silvia. Rachel is the author of Austin Years, a memoir in 5 novels, A Chance Meeting Intertwined Lives of American Writers and Artists, which won the Penn Gerard Fund Award and was a finalist for the Guardian First Book Prize, and Bernard Berenson, A Life in the Picture Trade, which was longlisted for the J.Q. Wingate Literary Prize. Her essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Guardian, The London Review of Books, The Believer, and elsewhere. She's the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the MacDowell Colony, and the New York Foundation for the Arts, and teaches in the Creative Writing Program at the University of Chicago. Welcome back, Rachel. And only recently we had a wonderful conversation also both with Tess and Rachel. So I'm really delighted to have you back for this event. So welcome back. The floor is yours, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here at the virtual Deutsches Haus and to see you again, Juliana, and to be part of this conversation, which I'm so much looking forward to today. So I, rather than doing formal introductions, I only wanted to give you a quick sense of who we'll be hearing from today, and then you'll learn about them as we go. So we're gathered in celebration of a really wonderful new book by Silvia Boadella, Sophie Taeuber-Arp, A Life Through Art. And this book has been translated, as you've heard, by the wonderful translator Tess Lewis. So Silvia Boadella is a writer and psychotherapist. She lives in Switzerland, where she directs the Institute of Biosynthesis. And she's also a person with experience in many different art forms. And we'll talk about that a little bit later today. And she's the great niece of the artist in question. And her more formal bio is appearing. And Tess Lewis is a distinguished, multifaceted translator, one of our most distinguished translators from German, I might say, and has recently did this wonderful book, Marianne Lecki's novel, What You Can See From Here, as the latest in a long line of wonderful books. So welcome to both of you. I'm so pleased to be sharing a screen with you. And to get to celebrate the work you've done and Sophie Taeuber-Arp's work too. So I think we'll begin this conversation just by talking a little bit about the artist herself, and Silvia, how you came to write this book and write it in the way that you did. And so I think most people will have some familiarity with the artist, and we just got a little introduction about her and her work, but maybe just to begin, could you just tell us a little bit about her work and how you see her work, Silvia?
I'm deeply impressed by Sophie since a long time, especially because of her attitude towards life. She lived during 2 world wars and had to withstand enormous challenges. And in all of this, she kept true to herself. She kept passionately devoted to her art, and even drew enormous strength from creating her art. And so I was impressed by this, and as well by the joy which she radiates, even in these outermost difficult situations, and which is very much, as I see it, expressed in her whole oeuvre. And so Sophie was a teacher for me, and I tried somehow to follow her in that sense. And I wrote the book in order to get more guidance, to more understand how she was able to do all that. I had even once a dream where I dreamt Sophie has transformed a nightmare into a dream. And then I wrote the book of this vested interest of myself, and hopefully as well to others. And that was then as well guiding me in how I was writing the book, because in order to understand what she was actually be able to do, to understand her attitude, I had to illuminate her from inside herself, because I had like to dive into the mind of the artist. And I, of course, I have noted everything what I have heard from my family. So this is basically grounded in facts. But then I had to go in this term of fiction in order to use my imagination. And what I hope I could do is to do it in a resonance to Sophie, in a resonance to how she would have felt, how she would have thought, how she would have created her works, like diving into that creation process. And I have a feeling or a hope that in this I follow Sophie's own approach she had towards her art. And to round up what now I answered, I have prepared one quote from Sophie, which I would like to read about this.
That would be lovely.
Yes, I just created it. I have it here. So let's see.
Great.
Yes, I just.
Yeah, go ahead and look for it.
Yes, I have it.
Yeah.
She wrote this down in 1922, and she says, "Only when we delve into ourselves and try to be entirely true, will we succeed in bringing forth things of value, lively things, and so help to form a new style that suits us."
Yeah, that's really, I think you've put so many things together for us at the beginning, and that gives it such a good sense of the kind of artistic project of this work that you've done, which is these vignettes, these short meditations on that kind of begin, and they're always in the consciousness of the artist, and then we kind of follow through. And it's something I really admire in the book, that there's this fluidity, that we're sort of with her. There's the dream life, there's the natural world, there are the artistic creations, and there's a flow among them, so that you really see a certain idea coming into the artist's mind and then being turned, and maybe it emerges as beadwork, or maybe it emerges as a painting, or maybe it becomes a marionette performance. There's always different possibilities, but there's still real clarity about the artistic conception, which is, I think, very difficult to render, and is done so beautifully throughout your book, as I read it in Tess's English. I wonder if, just for people who may not be familiar with her work, if Zara, if you could just show us just quickly a few of the slides, just to give a little sense of kind of what this is the artist, and this is her with Hans Arp, sometimes also known as Jean Arp, who was her partner of a long time. And then if you just would like flip, this is a weaving, for example, and maybe show us a couple more, just so people have the kind of, yes, I love these. This is a drawing on the left, preparatory for a watercolor study on the right. And then maybe show us two more, Zara. Oh, there's some little thing has appeared, but.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's been, there we go.
Yeah, good. And then this kind of beadwork also she did, that was really so beautiful. So you get a feeling for the use of color and shape that's really deep in this artist's work. Yeah, great. So yes, and then I love this, how you see the shapes enter into a new medium, this drawing that has so closely related to the beadwork. All right, Zara, maybe take us back to our, so Sylvia, I wonder if you could tell us a little, I know that you kind of grew up with some of these works, could you tell us a little bit about your own kind of early associations? Did you actually live with some of these works, or are they part of your family's life?
These works, which are now in the PowerPoint, I mostly have grown up with them. They were in my grandmother's house in Erika Schlegel. And I went in and out in that house in Zurich. Spent my holidays there. So some description what happened in that house.
Can I just ask a clarifying question, Silvia? Erika Schlegel was Sophie's sister, is that correct?
Right. Erika was Sophie's 5 years older sister.
And so you were able to go in and out of Erika, Sophie's sister's house, and Erika had kept these works, had lived them, surrounded by them. I see.
Yes, it was surrounded. And they were wearing, although Erika was wearing the necklaces, which you see she was wearing. She was going out with it, and with this pearl bag, which we like so much. It was used. It was used, and that tablecloth was just lying on the table. Of course, they wouldn't eat on it like in my story, but it was there, and. But I have written the book not from originals. I don't have any originals in my house. And of course, they don't belong to me. It got distributed, but I have all done from reproductions. But I did it. I was, even for this, Sophie is an example, because I think she was working very meditatively. Even Hans Arp said about her, she was working in a so-called framed stillness, if I translate it right. And I was writing all my little stories. I was writing it very, very early in the morning when I get up out of my dream in the night. I went up, and then I went in this meditative state and was just listening what came to me. And of course, I worked then over and over again, but always again from the again and again out of this meditation.
Yeah, that's so interesting to know your working process and what you said about growing up with them, going in and out of your grandmother's house, that there's a very beautiful atmosphere of the sister relationship between your grandmother, Erika, and her sister, the artist, Sophie. And there are moments between the two of them where they're looking at the necklaces or looking at the art together. And it's interesting to know how intimately you are associated with that. In some sense, you're the only person who could write that, that material in that way that would give us that access to that, imagination to that. I wonder if you would like to read for us a little bit, just to have a sense of the material. And I know you had chosen a couple of selections for us to have a sense of it, and maybe that's a good way into the book.
Yes, I would like to read two texts, the first two texts, and I just get it here ready. Maybe just something for how I composed the book, why it came to these first two texts. The first text is Des, and the second text is First Meeting. And I have composed my whole story in between two Des, in between her death, and then I let her resurrect in all what I tell about her, and then I end the book again with the death, hoping that the reader and even myself, arriving the second time to the death, I will have a different feeling. Because I just want to say in advance that Sophie, and that was always painful for me, had a tragic accidental death. She died with only 53 years old on a carbon monoxide poisoning. And this I describe in my own way. It is based on facts told by Max Bill, because in Max Bill's house, the great artist in Zurich, who has passed away as well now, she died in his garden house, and it was an incredible shock for everyone. So I like to read this and just tell you, I chose an image which are the two earrings and the brooch Alexander Calder has done for Sophie. He has specially designed it for Sophie and has then given it as a gift to her. And in my story, it is like a symbol of hope for Sophie, like these earrings dangling on her ears. And she imagined to see her in America, where she was planning to immigrate. And then I put this as an image after her death, because then it looks to me after her death like a burial gift, like a medieval or like an ancient, not medieval, ancient burial gift. So I just come to the text. Death. Sophie signed a series of paintings late into the night. She was determined to finish. The melody of her name on her works made her happy. She had recently fled to Switzerland with Hans. Yet Zurich will only be an intermediate stop. They are planning to emigrate to America. Graz, Zurich, New York. This is their itinerary, imprinted in her like a bird's migratory path, out and into a new future. Calder, Mondrian, Max Ernst, and many other friends are already waiting for them. With delight, Sophie pictured the earrings Calder has given her, two spiral mobiles dangling from her ears in the new world. She is visiting Binya and Max Bill, the last tram back to her sister Erika's, with whom she is staying temporarily, has already departed. I can sleep in the garden house. I don't mind if it's unheated, Sophie says, exhausted. She would like to go to sleep as soon as possible and not cause Binya the slightest trouble. To get up early the next morning and devote herself to her art, to sketch, to put her ideas on paper. No need to waste any time with the heating. She'll warm up quickly under the covers. Her body will soon spread its cozy warmth. And if it's too cold, she can always light the fire in the stove. She doesn't know how coal ovens work, but it's hardly sorcery. Sophie wades through the snow down to the garden house and opens the door. It's colder inside than she'd expected. The thin walls are not insulated. She stretches out on the bed in her clothing and tries to sleep. Her feet are cold. She feels lonely. Surely she can warm up the bed. She opened the French dictionary to look up a rarely used word. She's freezing. She gets out of bed and opens the stove's little black door. Everything is prepared for lighting. Newspaper is crumbled into a ball under a small pyramid of thin pieces of wood, like a small work of art. She smiles. Here, too, she encounters beauty. She picks up the matchbox, takes out a match, lights it, and holds it to the paper. A flame rises, the kindling crackles promisingly, but does not give off any heat. I'll go to bed for a moment and rest. Then I'll feed it thicker pieces of firewood, she thinks. Smoke envelopes her. That must be the fern wind blowing, but opening the window now would just make the room colder. Tired, she closes her eyes and falls into a doze. Smoke fills the garden house. It billows from the iron stove. Sophie lies very still, the white duvet pulled up to her chin. The smoke spreads more thickly. The fire in the stove goes out. Icy cold clings around the dead woman. Frost flowers spread over the window panes. Final station, Zurich, Hunk. It is 13th January 1943. First meeting. White jasmine blooms on her work table. Lost in thought, Sophie draws the blossoms. A pale green flicker radiates from the flower's 5-petaled star. In the backlight, a darkness appears in the delicate, almost transparent calyx. Nature's beauty defies imitation. Sophie erases the drawing, opens her eyes wide, and absorbs the rhythms of the white stars. With abandon, she sketches a composition of circles, triangles, and finally arched lines from which the jasmine blossoms wink at her. Go into the city. We'll meet again there. Not much later, she is strolling along Bahnhofstrasse and enters the Tanner Gallery. That is where she sees it. A carpet with dancing triangles and organic forms from which the scent of jasmine wafts towards her. She glances at the sign on the wall below it to the right. In black and white, Hans Arp. Ah, she whispers, it's you. She returns to the gallery again and again until he stands before her. Dressed elegantly like her, they meet as equals. He smells of enchantment. Unruffled, she heads toward the carpet. Is this your work? It speaks to me. I also play with triangles and circles. He raises his hat. Hans. She bows her head. Sophie.
Lovely. It was just wonderful to hear that in your voice. Thank you for reading those for us. As I was listening, I was thinking about the thing that you said about writing the book partly because she was a teacher to you and it was a way to get more guidance to write the book. I thought that was so interesting. And then also what you said about the Calder earrings being like a kind of burial gift. I was just thinking about the sort of circularity that you were sort of drawing from her, and then also in a way trying to give back. It seemed like to me like making a kind of gift of this work to in kind of honor of her. And it seemed I really could hear that circularity in as you were reading. So that was very nice to get to hear that. I wonder, Tess, if you wanted to say a word about as you were translating it, how you were trying to get the voice, that difficult interior voice. And I know you always have interesting literary models that you're working with. And
it was this time, it was slightly different because there's such a strong visual element. And so I found it very helpful to have illustrations that Silvia has beautifully chosen, and they're excellent reproductions in the book, which adds to their charm. So having these joyous, exuberant illustrations complements Silvia's recounting of her life as one, despite the hardship that was always filled with joy, and always, the aesthetics and the visual played such an important part. But in terms of the voice, I like to turn to works that either remind me of the tone, that evoke the same tone or atmosphere, or capture a certain movement of voice. And in this case, the overlap with Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless was uncanny, not just in the straddling of fact and fiction, but also in the way that the narration moves inside and outside of the character's head. So you get the shifts between the internal and the external life, whether it's through the narrator in Sleepless writing to her friend Mary McCarthy, or it's Sophie speaking either to herself or to her sister or to Hunt's book. So that was helpful. Also, the way Elizabeth Hardwick wrote often in short, almost fragmented sentences, and that are very evocative and suggestive. So they do a lot of work implicitly, not explicitly, not by describing, but by suggesting. And I think that is something that I found in Silvia's text. And another comparison, which is maybe a little intimidating and might seem gross, but was Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, because you get the movements, again, you see the characters from inside and outside in a very seamless flow. I was thinking also, the time we were together on Zoom, Rachel, was a conversation with Mariana Lakey, who was describing her narrative voice. What she was trying to do is create radical subjective consciousness. So it is a first-person narration, but the narrator knows more about what's going on in inner lives of others. So while according to the MFA programs, that's a mistake, if you do it well enough, it is kind of a three-dimensional experience of reading. So I had those two writers in mind as I was trying to capture the flow of this particular text.
Yeah, that's wonderful because, I love that Elizabeth Hardwick book. So it's so nice to know that that was something that you were thinking about. And right, I have this sense of, there can be a kind of periodicity in literary style and in literary consciousness in a way, like what seems like a way to evoke consciousness. And there is a kind of like the 30s, the 60s, and some of that comes back now. So I can feel how that would fit both for Sophie Taeuber-Arp herself, whose own artistic work is in that modernist moment, and then for our return to those kinds of considerations and the sense of how much consciousness can be shared is something that's is of endless interest in literary life and also in psychoanalytic life. So it's I can feel how that fits together. Could you repeat, Tess, just you used the phrase that Mariana Lakey used for that, her idea about consciousness, but your sound broke up for me just at that moment. Could you just say it?
I mean, of course, she was a translator herself, so I don't know if this exactly captured what it really means in German. I haven't heard the German. But she talked about thinking of this kind of almost choral approach to narration, the blending of first and third person as radical subjective consciousness. You know, so there's a consciousness narrating the book. And yes, it primarily inhabits the first person protagonist narrator, but it also slips into the other characters' heads.
Yeah, she's very bold about not feeling that you wouldn't necessarily know what the inner life of someone else is like. And I find that exhilarating and helpful as a writer. Silvia, when you were thinking about the fictional voice, it's not a fictional, I mean, it is not fiction, but it is imaginative, the work that you've done, and kind of near to fiction sometimes. When you described kind of the sense of like waking early in the morning, working from the dream life yourself, and I think dreams are very powerful in the book. Like I feel that that's part of how I have access to that character that you've made, is I feel like I'm sharing her dreams. And by the end, I think that's part of my great attachment to the character, even though they're just these little sketches, that I feel I've been dreaming with her. And I wonder if you could say, I mean, did you invent those dreams? In one case, I know there was there were notes that she made of a dream, and I think you incorporated that into the book. But how did you sort of research or draw on her life in order to make the voice that you made?
I researched, of course, in all I have known from my family, like in the story of death, like I read, it is following what, how I have said, what I have heard about the circumstances, and then about the dreams I describe in the book. These dreams are not dreams which were shared in my family. So this was, I tried to get inside her mind and help certain experiences with a dream. So I have just to think of dreams. I think the longest dream in the story is The Jungle Awakes, which Tess has translated absolutely marvelously. And I had suddenly, just to tell about my interaction with her, I had suddenly a feeling, because I know that Sophie has really loved native art already. I had a feeling the jungle has to speak to modern art. It was just something which I felt very, very strongly. And then I went myself to the jungle, to this very, very old, it was there, the Mayan tradition, to the pyramids. And I didn't know why I did it. But then when I was sitting on a pyramid, watching the sunrise over the jungle, and the whole jungle was awaking in its sounds and got alive, it was like a kind of sacred moment before they were maybe looking for food and getting at each other. And then I was so impressed about this enormous jungle, which actually was covering cities, whole cities. And you know, cities were very much shaped in edges and architecture, which is one of the basic elements in Sophie's art. And then by this jungle and the earth, this loomy earth and all these trees overwhelming these architectures and cultures, I had a feeling of even our art and Sophie's art, it's maybe only a moment in the life of aeons we are in. And then I suddenly, and this I experienced when we were looking at the sunrise, it was a very small group out of a meditation circle. And this woman was rising up and was singing over the jungle. And then I had like a feeling, I hear Sophie's voice at that moment. And this gave me a feeling of, this is something beyond everything. Like, I had even a feeling this could even survive everything. And I had this, and this is an example for Tess' wonderful partnership as a translator. We had a little email contact because I wrote this, the voice was as if it were eternal. And Tess first translated as it was timeless. And then we had a contact, shall it be timeless or eternal? And Tess made a micro-analysis, like a philosopher. What is the difference between timeless and eternal? And I was having almost sleepless nights to decide. And finally, I decided for my version eternal, only because I felt it was more carrying the sound of what I wanted to say. Even maybe timeless was more right for the meaning. Just to tell you about this. So this was the biggest dream, but I had a feeling it matches very well with a very early oeuvre, which is not in the PowerPoint, where it was like structures of steps of pyramids. It has a very, it has a feeling of that for me. And so I added it. And this is maybe a most exceptional piece of dream.
That's great. I'm really happy I asked that question because there was so much behind there. And I think eternal is the right choice. I you know, speaking, not knowing the original German myself, but between the two of you, I can completely imagine that conversation. And it does seem, I mean, there is a spirituality about this book and about your sense of Sophie Taeuber-Arp, and that seems really important to convey it. And I was just from a historical kind of point of view, I was really interested in, I mean, there's this strong connection with Jung and his work and the sense of mythical archetypes and the kind of feeling that dreams kind of go toward these collectively understood visions of formation and destruction. And I wonder, I learned from this book, but didn't realize that, so was your grandmother was the librarian for a Jung?
Yes.
Yes.
She was a librarian and she was very, they were a friend, Jung was a friend of their family. And that's why Sophie had an access to all of these archetypal ideas, but I heard my grandmother saying that, but this is more from Hans Arp, that he said to her, why does Ziggy Young not understand better our art? And has more an openness towards this kind of concrete art if he has this feeling for archetypes. So, you know, so that was one of the conversations I heard. So there was not a resonance in that way from Ziggy Young towards their art, but they were getting it like a gift, what he had to teach it. And because in this club, in the psychological club in Zurich, where Erika was working in the organization, they had very interesting guests, like Richard Wilhelm came, and Sophie had access to this when she was in Zurich.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I wonder if Zara, if you might want to show us well, a couple of pieces that we haven't looked at yet, but one that I was thinking of when you read the first meeting. I was thinking of the slide that's on 13, I think, Zara. That's it's sort of an idea of two figures that is interpreted in the book as Sophie and Hans Arp together. So maybe that would be a good one to see. Yeah, there it is. And I think that I think that is a nice one to kind of have a sense of how the life and the art were kind of moving one into another. And maybe that follows also a little bit from what you said. I like that idea that he was like, if he's so interested in these archetypes, how come he doesn't understand what we're doing in a deeper? Because there is a way that these abstractions make these very general possibilities, you know, from which there's a lot to think through. And maybe, I don't know which pieces, Tess, you might read for us next, but there's also a photograph, Zara, that has some marionettes on it. And I think that's now, let's see, I think that's number
5.
Is it number 5? Yeah, thank you. So you might see that also. But then there's, yeah. So this is also, these are marionettes and also a dance that she created. And there's a kind of interesting drawing together of different artistic traditions that were powerful to her. Through Jung and other people, they were interested in Hopi practices. I mean, there's an old marionette tradition in Central Europe, but there are also Asian traditions of puppetry. And then there's, I know from the book that they were interested in Tibetan and Buddhist art. And so there's a really interesting kind of international and open sense of artistic influence that runs through the practices that they were, and then some of, you know, what modernism sometimes people rightly complain of. Sometimes there's a putting lots of different things together. But Tess, I don't know if this leads into something that you would like to read for us, or we could also look at a weaving if you were thinking of that.
No, I think it's important to read the dance section.
Yeah.
And you can leave that illustration up because it's very pertinent to this section. And the reason I think this, like a few other sections, is because movement was obviously very important to Sophie's artistic life, her inner life, her artistic life, and her expressiveness. So this dance is kind of, from the reading about it and from the costumes, looks very aggressive and assertive, but it seems to me an bold move into interpretive dance for the time. And Sophie's courage comes through this section. And just something I wanted to add to what you've so eloquently said about Sylvia's approach to this life is, and the dreams and the reimaginings. There are several times where Sylvia kind of puts herself into Sophie's life and imagines what might have led to the creation of particular artwork. So obviously, Sylvia doesn't have any way of doing that, but it is a plausible explanation, perhaps, how Sophie channeled her inspiration at different times of her life, whether experience as a child into later artworks or very recent experiences into whatever she's trying to express through whatever medium. The one I suppose it helps to know before this section is that just before this section, she saw a tree being cut down outside her house and was very sort of taken aback by this. But I will read the section dance. Tonight, Dancing by Sophie Taeuber is written on a sign outside the bar. The audience is keyed up, drinking and smoking raucously. She steps onto the stage, silence falls. Sophie dances the birch tree. Birds nest in her limbs. Her hands rustle. Soft spring air wafts around her. On her skin, buds open in tiny fans. Then a motor saws into her. The pain is unbearable. Her body jerks in wild spasms. She falls. She lies face down on the ground, motionless. The audience holds its breath, waits for her. Sophie smells earth, moldy Swedish, just as when she was a young child in Davos, searching for her father. Where are you, she calls, filled with longing. No answer, just dark colors. Now something is taking shape in the colors. She can't see it clearly yet. It rises within her, and she slowly gets up. She stands upright, feels her feet, coolness. A light yellow primrose appears in her eyes, a cowslip, as she called these flowers that grew so thickly in the meadows when she was a child. Sophie plucks the flower from her eye and holds it out in front of her by its light green stem. There you are, Father. She can feel the audience looking at her in astonishment. The soles of her feet fill with warmth, set down roots and spread out to the people in the room. Drawing nourishment from this extensive web of roots, life juices rise in her like sap, fill her crown with the power of spring, and envelop her in a silvery sheen. Birds perch in her branches, which tremble with their trills. Deafening applause. She sees her sister sitting in the front row. Sophie goes up to her and hands her the invisible flower. Erica takes it. To inspire you as a writer, a way to slip into heaven, Sophie whispers to her. Hans approaches with Marcel Janko and Hugo Ball. Hans, that was wonderful. He hands her 2 notes. I wrote them for you as you danced. On one of them, Sophie reads, all the birds in the world flew into your eyes. And on the friendly birds fly around our eyes. Sophie blushes, a declaration of love? Hugo, you raised the heavens like a skylark in flight. Please dance to one of my poems. Marcel, I'll make a mask for you. Hans, and I'll design the costume. Not long after this, the rector of the School of Applied Arts summoned Sophie to his office. You are forbidden to take part in any further Dada actions. If you still participate, you will lose your position here. Sophie thinks of the birch tree, tied up, cut down. She stands proudly before the rector. I heard you, she says, turns and leaves the room. The following evening, she returns to the stage. Over her head, she has placed a mask with ellipses for eyes and a half-moon mouth. Her eyes shine through the cardboard and onto the audience like laser beams, signaling, here I am again, dancing. At the opening of the Gallery Dada, Sophie dances to Hugo's sound poem Caravana, wearing a frightening cubicle mask designed by Marcel and a sack dress by Hans. She has made her arms longer with cardboard tubes. The mask is wide enough for her to shake her head violently inside it in righteous anger at the world. The untamed aspect of Dada appeals to her, and she enjoys the respect of her artist friends. Now that illustrates not just Sophie's boldness in her aesthetic choices, but also, as Sylvia said, she remained true to herself and wasn't intimidated either by the disapproval or machinations of some of her male artist colleagues or, her employers or, society in general.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you read that. And it's so interesting to think of movement, of just the movement of one's own body as a kind of resistance to these demands and limitations, and of kind of radical movement. I was thinking about like Martha Graham's contractions or other, like the kinds of movement that she's embodying in kind of reliving the destruction of that tree. And there is a way that, I feel the kind of environmental consciousness that's in the book. And of course, the sense of the destructibility of, that nature can be destroyed has been enormously augmented in the time since they were practicing their art. But it's interesting to see the seeds of awareness in what they're doing. And I think that's such an important part of Dada, that it was politically really so deeply resistant to a lot of the things that we're still trying to resist and change in our lives now. So I just find that really helpful, as you both were saying. And looking at those marionettes, I have copied out many passages of the book that I'm still thinking about, but there's a little part where, Sylvia, you're writing about the marionettes and her making them. And it says, she could have painted, embroidered, or woven them, but no, she recreated them as marionettes so that they could move weightless, tumbling dreamily. Each one has got a headdress visible, made of brass, wood, feathers, or glass beads, and her own has remained invisible. And it's a very nice moment. There are many where there's a sort of consideration of different artistic media and a sense of like, how does this get expressed, this thought or this artistic understanding, something that comes from the well of the individual or collective subconscious, and then how does it find its place? So I think at
the show in MoMA, they have a whole big case of the marionettes, and they have running on a loop a recreation of her marionette play King Stag, which gives you that sense of weightless movement.
Oh, fantastic. I'm so hopeful of getting to see this show. And that is the next thing I wanted to turn to, which is this big show, which has had such success. It started in Basel, and then it was at the Tate Museum, and now it's in New York. And I think, there was already a emerging understanding of Sophie Taeuber-Arp as a major artist of the 20th century, but now that seems really like very much taken hold. It's one of the most talked about shows this year. And there's a question in the Q&A that I can pass on to you, Sylvia, about whether you were at all involved in the planning of the show, or if those things happened independently, the arrival of your book and the show.
I was involved in it for my family, looking what kind of works could travel, because there were different selections of works for Basel and the Museum of Modern Art are the two largest exhibitions, and then is the Tate, which was the smallest one and had only few works. And then there were works which were too delicate, like someone who in the museum where the works are takes care of it. So, for example, this green chain, which is on one of the pictures, should have gone to New York, but then in the last moment in London, a pearl was getting loose. So I had somehow to take care that this, yeah, it's here. You can already see the fragility. And then I had like to take care that this wouldn't travel and things. So I was more involved in this, but not in the concept. I think they have a wonderful concept, which is shown in their catalog, and it's the same concept for the 3 retrospective, where they really emphasize as well her and her position as a female artist in her time, which was a very difficult position and a very unusual position. And as well, they really have an amazing show of her, of the variety of her works through genres, through different, how would you say, Tess, through different, I can't hear you.
Genres or forms or medium.
Okay.
Medium is also
all medias, exactly.
Materials. I mean, because she's so,
Yes.
universal and comprehensive,
Yes.
it's hard to find a single word for all her categories.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's super. I think, right, I'm really just thinking about her as an architect, as an interior designer, as a conceptual artist, as a, that there's so many kind of facets to what she was thinking about. And I wonder, you mentioned kind of thinking of her as a female artist, and I mean, part of my sense of the reception of her, which is that there's a sense that she was forgotten and neglected because she was a woman artist. So there's she is part of this kind of general rehabilitation that I hope is happening, of kind of restoring some forgotten artists to their rightful places. And of course, she faced a lot of difficulties at the time because there were prejudices then too about who should be heard and who should be given credit for things. You touch on that a little bit in the text in terms of the relationship that she had with Hans Arp. I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about that.
The relationship with Hans Arp was a very deep relationship, and in that way, very fulfilling. And they supported each other as artists a lot. And Hans Arp was very supportive of her. Sometimes he said to people who organized an exhibition, I give only my works if Sophie is shown as well. So he was really, this is this image back to back, which you emphasized, like I say in my text, they are fortified, 2 people, 1 figure. And they were like this. This is one aspect. But on the other hand, he didn't want to bother with practical things. And that was very well talked by my grandmother about it. So Sophie had, besides she was teaching and earning in that way to make a stability of the income, this was one thing she did. And then the practical thing she really had to organize. So she was left with this. So I wonder how she grabbed all the time together to do her art, but she was, I guess, very disciplined to do that. And so it was, I think she had a lot of endurance and of pride in herself, even because even she was, as a female, in the genre at that time, more put down, because when she made a carpet, that was a piece of artisan. When Hans Arp made a carpet, you know what happened? He put it in a frame and it was a piece of art. That is, you know, this is an example.
Yeah.
And I think, yes, no?
Go ahead.
I want just to say, I think, and I tried to emphasize this maybe indirectly in my book, that she had a holistic view of life. And this was, if I can summarize it, it was that aesthetics, or let's say even beauty, was not something which was like a category or something finalized in a piece of art. It was a so-called spiritual attitude towards life. So I have a feeling, and this is as well expressed in the text I read and in many parts of my text, I have a feeling she recognizes in whatever situation she still can realize something which is beautiful, like the little pyramid for lightening the fire, and vice versa. If she cooks, if she paints, if she maybe helps her sister with her children, this is an attitude in her which has as well this alignment to beauty. Maybe it's a bit, I don't know if I could put it right, but for example, she has sketched a cupboard. This is too in the catalogue of MoMA. A cupboard, and there she has in a rhythmic way designed volumes where to hang a shovel or a broom. And now how this is placed in that cupboard is not only a practical matter, but it's as well an action of aesthetics, of beauty.
Yeah, that's very nice. I've written down a couple of your phrases. I like an action of aesthetics very much. And also just that something is not finalized as a work of art. I think that's very important for a lot of contemporary conceptual artists working now, that they really don't want there to be a finished product that's for sale. They want a kind of movement that's that is caught for a little while in material circumstances and then kind of moves again. We happily have 15 or 20 more minutes to talk together and a few questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to kind of bring those into the conversation. Somebody asked Silvia, if you would say, if you think there are certain people who were artistic influences on Sophie in her early career, are there artists who you think were important to her or kinds of work that were important to her?
For sure, Hans Arp, her husband, was very inspirational. Then Sonia Delaunay was her very good friend, was a great inspiration. And then generally talked, she was very interested in architecture. And in architecture, somehow you structure spaces and you structure life. And then she had as well this deep interest in dance, where you are in a movement. And of course, she was working for Laban, but her choreographies she did were very much her own. But then I think in her whole work, she was like bringing these two almost contradictory or opposite elements into a very exciting dialogue. And this is, I think, one of her bases. And in architecture, she was influenced by the Bauhaus, by the time before and after.
When you say these two elements, are you thinking of dance and architecture as being, yes, like space and motion, and thinking about, yes. Yeah, that's very helpful. Another question from Lucy. How did seeing Sophie Taeuber-Arp's work in these three exhibition contexts, did that change your thinking about the art of your great aunt, or do you see it differently now that it's been on display in these different places?
I have seen Basel, which was very a large exhibition, and it was filling me with so much joy that she is now so much coming out in her art. And there was the last exhibition room in Basel where all these paintings, this line painting, which we have one too here. And it was like a huge song, all this line painting. And I stayed in it and I stayed in it, and I couldn't detach anymore. So it is very fulfilling. And as well, because of this sudden death she had so early, one of my main question, if I could ask her again, would be, would you see your life nevertheless as fulfilled? And when I was standing in this room in Basel with these singing lines, I heard a very deep yes. But of course, it's my imagination, but it's my hope.
Yeah, that's so nice. Right. I mean, that's what we have, these hopes. I think that's very illuminating. And it also, it's interesting, I think, to see many works together that often you see separately, or that you have separate experiences of, and sometimes they do sort of accumulate into these resonant moments in a way that's hard to get little by little. So I think that's a real offering of these big exhibitions. The next, we have several more questions. Another is for Tess. Stephanie Layloff has asked, how do you work on preserving the voices of Silvia and Sophie, as both their voices are in the book? She says she missed the beginning, so she doesn't know if we addressed this, but we haven't really. So yes, the book is very much in kind of consciousness, but it's also in a third person. It's Sophie does this and does that. It's not a first person narration. So there's lots of different kinds of texture in the prose. And Tess, if you want to talk about that, that would be great.
Yeah, it wasn't that difficult in this case, simply because when Silvia has Sophie speak, it's generally short and directed. What was more difficult was making sure that this, the sort of underlying intuitive, conscious stream of consciousness voice didn't get too sort of vague and diffuse and fuzzy. So trying to sort of energetic and flowing towards, following the narrative tension, but leaving it open to several possibilities at the same time. So the balancing act was actually more in fine-tuning the overall omniscient narrative voice, consciousness, the voice of the omniscient consciousness, rather than the relatively limited interjections made by Sophie in the text.
Whenever I listen, Tess, to you speaking about translation, I half wish that you would translate my own works for me into English. You know, I think you might have a finer sense of how to do these things. Like I should write them and then you could just translate them. You know, that would be great. And then they might actually sound the way I want them to in English. That's really a helpful answer.
I have an Austrian author who jokes that there's what he tries to say, and then in English, it's what he really meant to say.
Yeah.
But I think he's being overly generous. I don't.
But that sounds quite plausible to me too. Yeah. Yeah, I had a scrupulous German translator of my own first book, and many things got better in that German version than, he was like, this is not precise, and I would say, oh, you're right, we could do better. So a few practical questions, Silvia, about the kind of paper maybe that was used for the embroidery work. The question is, did Sophie Taeuber-Arp use millimeter paper or millimeter papier to plan her embroidery work?
Yes, she had this transparent millimeter paperwork to sketch on. I found it, we had it even left in our house, some of it, and I called it, I call it in my story, and they called it as well, a tiny little house paper, this millimeter, where you can create something already with a very small line. And that is too from the family background. That's spot on.
Wonderful. I was just going to ask Zara if you would show number 4, this kind of paper, I think, is on the left-hand side. And I love that moment in the book where they talk about it as little houses that you can go inside the squares, and it gives this kind of depth to what you might otherwise think of as a flat, two-dimensional kind of surface because of the grid. But in fact, there's a lot that you can enter into. And then you see that reflected in the three-dimensional textile work and watercolor work. Yeah, that's a very nice question. Then the next question says, Silvia, thank you so much for speaking with us. And the questioner asks, did you think that Sophie's traditional education in the arts created a collaborative relationship in her projects? Or do you think that in some ways that might have held back her vision? That's the question. Does that make sense as a question?
Yes. She first, to start very early, when she was 6 years old, she moved to a place actually nearby where I live called Trogen, where the whole handcraft art was still very alive. People were weaving people were doing embroidery, people were doing bobbing laces. And she was all learning this from a small child on, because her mother has known this too. So first I want to say that she has later expressed herself through all this range of materials and genres was completely natural. And then she was actually going to, she was in St. Gallen and she learned a lot, and she was in Munich in one of the most avant-garde school at that time, where she wrote very positive letters about this, where she got a lot of encouragement actually to do what she did.
Yeah, great. We have three more questions and not too much time. So I'm going to jump to the most difficult one and then come to earlier ones. The most difficult one is, how did the family and especially Erica negotiate the tragic death of Sophie Taeuber-Arp? And you've spoken about that some already, but I don't know if there are other things you want to add.
Yeah, they were so shocked, and especially her husband, Hans Arp. I know that Max Bill woke him up with the music of Johann Sebastian Bach in order that he could tell this tragic news to him in a certain atmosphere. And Erika they were very shocked, and then they were really somehow taking care of Hans. So he was a lot in her house as well.
Thank you. That actually leads also to one of the other questions, which was if you could address the role of music for Sophie Taeuber-Arp as a kind of inspiration. Bach figures in your book, and I know was an important composer for her, but if you want to say a little bit about music in her work.
In her work, I think she is a composer, and she is like a musician somehow. They are like melodies, they are songs. But I know this about Johann Sebastian Bach. Like I describe it, this is based on facts. And then I know that they listen to music. And I know that they were, for example, invited in Maya Sacher's house, where also Hindemith, for example, was going in and out. So they were two as well related to contemporary music. So that was a life.
Yeah. And at that time, there was a lot of thinking in their world by Kandinsky, by other people, about the relationship of color and musical tone. And so that was a really deep discussion in that, among those artists in that period of time.
Yes.
So the last question that we have in our list is about the cover image of the beautiful book. And I wonder if maybe both of you, each of you, would like to say something about the book is very beautiful. And Tess, you already alluded to how important the images were to you in figuring out how to do the translation, but just kind of thinking about the interplay of different arts, the cover, the works inside. If maybe Tess, do you want to say something about that? And then Silvia?
Well, this is based on a photograph, but it's a head of Hans Arp that she drew, correct, Silvia? And it shows, I think it shows very beautifully the way these two separate people shared a vision, of an artistic vision and an artistic mission. So that, you know, the cover speaks
Yes. Mm-hmm.
very, you know, fully intuitively to the contents of the book. And I think Sylvia's done a wonderful job matching up the illustrations to her texts, or maybe these are just artworks that inspired the text. But when you read through the book, there's kind of a counter between the text and the visual aspect. So it's a nice symbiotic, you know, multi-genre, multi-sensory, I should say, reading experience.
Thank you very much, Tess. Yes, it's spot on. It's this picture, very young picture of Sophie, smiling Sophie, we called it, together with this Dada head, which Sophie did of her husband, somehow just shows the courage as well how you see how she shows her teeth, which are a bit uneven, and it doesn't matter. It is just this very much natural. Yeah, it shows the naturalness of Sophie in her character, and it shows the dance between the line movement and the architectonics in this Dada head.
Yes, I was struck over and over in reading it how joyous the abstractions are, and it's just very interesting. It's such a stereotype of abstraction that it's cerebral, or that it's remote, or that you are meant to project all different kinds of things into it. But this really, and partly in seeing it in the different media, which I think is such a beautiful thing about the arrangement of page by page of the book, you feel the sort of migration of the movements through the different media, and it's just very splendid and joyful. And I do feel that that's such a tribute to the artist and to your understanding of the artist, and so I think that's really very meaningful. I'm so glad that you made this book out of all these closely held memories from you and your family, and then also all this research and other looking outward, because I think it's a very valuable contribution to the understanding of the artist and to the associations one might have with her work, and that she had with her work. So I thank you both so much for this conversation, which I think is recorded and which Deutsches Haus will, make available. So we have a record of it. I know I wrote many things down, but I may need to look back myself in order to get certain quotes just right. And I think that this conversation too offers something for future viewers of Sophie Taeuber-Arp's work, and for people going to see the MoMA show, which I encourage those of you in New York to make sure to visit and to read this beautiful book. And I think that brings us to our closing moment. I see Deutsches Haus has reappeared. So yes.
Yeah, thank you for taking the hint, Rachel, and thank you for this absolutely gorgeous moderation. The stuff you've brought to light so wonderfully and elegantly is amazing. It's been such a rich exchange, and at the same time, such a truly intimate conversation. So peaceful and meditative, which I think connects beautifully to the spirit that Silvia conjured up in her book, and that I feel like got conjured up again in this gathering of three beautiful minds, and the openness, and I can't quite think of the English word, the Vertrauensverhältnis. I think that became very apparent. Tess, please translate me.
Of course, on the spot, it's not always confidence. Confidence in each other.
Yeah, thank you. The
mutual support. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that was very special about this event, and I truly appreciated it. And I feel I've learned so much by reading this very fabulous book, by visiting the extensive exhibition at MoMA, which I was lucky to have already seen, but I do want to go back. But there's still so much to discover. The marionette display is fabulous. The movie, the embroidery works, just the wealth of the material this trailblazing woman worked in. And I am so happy that we get to see this work by somebody who has not been appreciated enough in the past. And and many more generations should appreciate it. And I will take my daughter to this exhibition. I know she will really like it. So again, thank you so much to the three of you. Thanks to the audience. If you can, go get the book. If you can, see the exhibition and think about Sophie Taeuber-Arp's work. Truly inspiring. And last but not least, I just want to do some shameless self-promotion. Join us next week when we have an event with Marcel Bayer, the German author, and I will see if I can drop this into the chat. I'm not good with this technology stuff, but maybe it will work. So you can immediately go to the website, and he will be in a conversation with his translator, his English translator, Katie Derbyshire. So we have another translator author conversation, which is one of my favorite formats. And now I've yacked on for way too much. Thank you. Have a beautiful afternoon. Have a beautiful evening wherever you are. Love this event. Take good care. And I'm sorry, Tess, Rachel, and Silvia, that we cannot go out for a nice civilized tea, but one of these days.
Another time. Yes.
Thank you.
Be well,
Thank
everybody.
you so much, Rachel. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Juliana.
Thank you all. Thank you, Zara.